Fast, I was like, it'll probably take more if I wait.
Well, welcome. Life is full of its momentary, it's just not going to work. Nope. It's full of its momentary glitches. And to think when I started in ministry all those years ago, a technical problem was an electric organ that didn't work. That was the technical problem. Or lights that didn't come on because everything else was on paper. And that makes me sound old, doesn't it? But literally when I started in ministry 38 years ago, yeah, you're a bit of it. We hand cranked mimeograph sheets. If you had a really expensive church budget, you had a basic one-side black print copier. You had your Sunday bulletins printed by somebody and shipped in for the month, already the basics filled out. And you sang out of hymn books, and everything was on paper. And so technical glitches where the lights won't come on, Pastor, or the heat's not running, or something like that. And now we're so dependent upon screens that if anything throws a wrench in the works, well, it's like the end of the world to us. And it's not. So tonight we're going to begin by reading together from Exodus 20. Or more to the point, we're going to be reading from Shemot 20 together, and we're just going to take turns in reading around. Instead of reading it all together, I'm going to read the verses, and we're just going to go around the table here, and then we'll move to Bradley and Sarah. When we get there, we're going to read chapter 20 of Shemot, or Exodus. You'll notice in the open page when you find chapter 20 that there is what is Torah and Shabbat and the traditional observance. And in the little purplish box, lavender box of what is Torah, you'll see Adonai. Adonai is the name for my Lord, my God. The Tetragrammaton, which is the theologically technical name for the name of God, Yahweh, represented in transliterated English by a YHWH, was so holy that you don't say it. And among the ultra-Orthodox here in Nashville today, at the Chabad of Nashville, which is in my neighborhood, and whose rabbi I know, and a number of his people, and I've been in there several times, worked on their playground and on and on and on. Anyway, they don't say God, because in English, God is transliterated English tetragrammaton. They can't say that, so they say GD. When they come to the word God in a conversation, I mean literally. And GD said, and that means God in their world. Okay? And so because the name of God is so holy, the proper noun, that they adopted two of the common linguistic terms. Adonai is my Lord, and El is the Canaanite prefix for a deity. And so they came to call him my Lord. In King James, if you see the Lord God, usually in the text, it's Adonai. And so you'll see this show up as we read. Okay, let's read together, and I'll read 1 and 2. We'll just move around the table. God said all these words. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the abode of slavery.
You are to have no other gods before me. You are not to make for yourselves a carved image or any kind of representation of anything in heaven or earth, heaven above or on earth beneath or in the water below the shoreline.
You are not to bow down to them or serve them, for I, Adonai, your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but displaying grace to the 1000th generation of those who love me and obeyed my mitzvah.
You are not to use lightly the name of Adonai your God, because Adonai will not leave unpunished someone who uses his name lightly. Remember the day Shabbat, to set it apart for God. You have 6 days to labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Shabbat for Adonai your God.
On it, you are not to do any kind of work, not you, your son, or your daughter, not your male or female slave, not your livestock, and not the foreigners staying with you inside the gates to your property. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, the sea and everything in them, but on the 7th day he rested. This is why Adonai blessed the Shabbat and separated it for himself.
Sarah, are you there?
She left just a second ago. They're having some major storms. Where what she was telling me.
Uh-huh.
She was really surprised that she was even with us at that point. So.
Well, I'm going to get James to get this posted because I'm recording it, so she'll be able to watch it, and we'll check on that. I'll check on that tomorrow and get that posted. Okay. Very good. Let's see. Where are we then?
12, I think.
12. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land which Adonai your GD is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false evidence against your neighbor.
Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female slave, his ox, his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. All the people experienced the thunder, the lightning, the sound of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled. Standing at a distance,
They said to Moshe, you speak with us and we will listen, but don't let God speak with us or we will die. Moshe answered the people, don't be afraid, because God has come only to test you and make you fear him so that you won't commit sins.
So the people stood at a distance, but Moshe approached the thick darkness where God was. Adonai said to Moshe, here is what you are to say to the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen that I spoke with you from heaven. You are not to make with me gods of silver, nor are you to make gods of gold for yourselves.
For me, you make only an altar of earth. On it, you will sacrifice your burnt offerings, peace offerings, sheep, goats, and cattle. In every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. If you do make me an altar of stone, you are not to build it out of cut stone. You're not to build it of cut stone. For if you use a tool on it, you profane it. Likewise, you are not to use steps to go up to my altar, so that you won't be indecently uncovered.
All right. May Adonai bless this, the reading of his word, yes? Okay, so the collect. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you Worthily magnify your holy name, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, we've got a lot of stuff to go through tonight. So on slide 4, we have places and terms, and we're going to motor through a bunch of them. The first one is, in all of these texts of history about the biblical period and the general region in which these stories all occur, they simply call it the ancient Near East, and so they use the 3 letters, the 3 abbreviations, and they don't spell out ancient Near East, it's just the ANE. And the map that's right there in front of you shows you exactly what it is. This is at the time where the Persians are lapping at the gates of the Babylonian Empire, the Second Babylonian Empire, and the Egyptian Empire is a shell of what it once was. More about that in a few minutes. And the Empire of Persia, which is really the land of the Medes and the Persians, put together, are knocking at the door of Babylon. And in fact, the king of Babylon, Nabonidus, will have been so reckoned as crazy by his own court that his generals and captains will open the gates of Babylon eventually and allow the Persians to walk in and capture the city pretty much unopposed. The bloodletting was mainly just the king and his court. The people were largely, well, when the people got up the next day, they couldn't tell anything had changed, which was the policy of the Medo-Persian king, founder of Achaemenid dynasty, the man we call Cyrus the Great. But this is near the end of the biblical story. You know, we have Ezra and Nehemiah and Malachi and so forth left to go in the Old Testament story at the time of this map. But most of what has happened is before this. And if you look on the map and you see Judah, Jerusalem, that's an area you have some familiarity with. When you go up, straight up from the Jerusalem dot, you'll see Tyre and then Sidon. All along that coastline, all the way up and all the way down to where the Egyptian gold is the land in which the seafaring people, the Phoenicians, in Hebrew, the Philistines, will be operating. That, what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, is everything that's kind of in that blood red. That's what Nebuchadnezzar had conquered. And the story where you see Memphis, that's near the Nile Delta, and from that star where you see Memphis in Egypt to the coast right above it, it's going to be part of tonight's story, and that's on the Nile River, and you go straight, almost straight down and to the right a little bit, and you see Thebes. You have Lower Egypt, which is where Memphis is. It's where the river starts at high altitude and slowly flows 2,000 miles downhill. And so Lower Egypt is the Egypt that is the fertile land. It is the land where the Hebrews or the Habaru will settle. Some people think they're the same thing, some people don't. And part of what we're going to walk into in just a minute is going to involve Memphis to Thebes, and then south of Thebes, off the map, is Cush. And it's the capital of Nubia, which today is in the country we call Sudan. And it was a significant place in its own right at various times in Egyptian history. What's called the Fertile Crescent runs from Thebes, where you have the Nile River running up to the Mediterranean, across Sinai right there to Mediterranean Sea, up to where it says Judah, up to where it says Phoenicia, the Jordan River Valley there. Then you go straight over to Nineveh, and you're on the Tigris River. The Tigris and the Euphrates run down right through Babylon, right down to near where Susa is on the map and empty into the Arabian Gulf. What we just traced is the Fertile Crescent. So I wanted you to be able to relate to these kinds of places, where they were in relation to one another as we go through them here tonight, because we're about to motor through a bunch of them. Okay, so the Fertile Crescent I just described to you. And today, Susa is replaced, and not exactly in the same spot, but close. Today, if you go to the map of Iraq on the coast of the Arabian Gulf, you will find Basra. And that is the modern day equivalent of Susa in ancient times. They're not built literally on top, one on top of the other, because the river and the river delta in each of these places is not the same today as it was then. Just like the Mississippi River Delta, we've been able to observe for more than 200 years as it continues to grow and move out into the Gulf of Mexico. The same thing happens in all great river deltas. It certainly happened in the Nile. And speaking of the Nile, Greek historian, the father of history, Herodotus, coined a phrase in his writings about the annual flood that made Egypt so fertile. That annual flood was called the gift of the Nile. The gift of the Nile made it through Western civilization until our times, when it was discarded as we don't, other than specialists, spend much time talking about this stuff. But in old encyclopedias from, say, 1940 or 1930, you'll find it. And it's given a more prominent treatment than today. That's not good or bad, it's just different. The amazing thing is that Egypt, throughout all of ancient times, is a rich land. Because of this, they don't get a lot of rain. You think of Egypt and you think of deserts and pyramids. But Egypt, in the river plain, which the Nile every year flooded, depositing rich silts. Remember, it's over 2,000 miles long. No, it's not 2,000, 1,200 or something like that. Long, very long. The Nile is actually longer than the Mississippi. It doesn't drain an area like the Mississippi because it's not in a land where there's a lot of rain. But because of this annual massive flood that you could count on, Egypt was the ancient breadbasket. Long before they became famous for cotton, they were famous for grain. In fact, when the first Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar, whose given name was Octavian, when he defeated Antony and Cleopatra, and they committed suicide, and he became the sole ruler of what was officially the Roman Republic, and that he would slowly gather the reins of power in until he became the first emperor, although he refused to allow them to use that term of him for much of his life, and he did not have a short life. He kept Egypt for himself. There would be no more kings of Egypt, no more queens of Egypt. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty. But why did he keep it? Because he who controls the food controls the people. And Augustus kept Egypt for the emperor. And every time you read in any history about bread and circuses trying to buy the allegiance of the plebeian or the ordinary people classes, it's Egyptian grain that's feeding Rome. It's not Italian grain, it's Egyptian grain that's feeding Rome. The emperor controls the staple of the diet for his people who are at his fingertips. That'll kind of help keep people in line, won't it? You never have a Roman emperor overthrown by the masses of the people. He's overthrown by people close to him or generals of legions who march against him and win in battle or something like that. Or they're murdered in their sleep in a conspiracy and so forth. There's no such thing in Roman history as a massive popular uprising to overthrow the emperor, monarchy, or so forth. There's plenty of uprisings, but it's a lot more narrowly focused than that. Sumer is in lower Mesopotamia. If you go back to your map and look at lower Mesopotamia, you're looking at what we call Iraq. And maybe as much as 3,500 years before Jesus, the Sumerians were a flourishing and advanced culture. They invented writing, law systems, the collection of proverbs or wisdom writings, formal schooling, and apparently the potter's wheel. Sumerians were very advanced. Was in the land of the Sumerians, and it is from there that Abraham came across the Fertile Crescent to the land that God said he would give him. The Akkadians, in 2400 BC, Sargon of Akkad became the first to conquer the Sumerians. Babylon rose up in its wake, and it was a city-state that conquered Sargon's empire. And the time of the Akkadians was brief. This is the first original Babylonian empire. This is 2,000 years before Jesus. And this is 1,400 years before Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar's time will be known as the Neo or New Babylonian Empire. Hammurabi and his eponymous law code comes from this city-state Babylon. It is codified in cuneiform, and somewhere roughly 1750, nobody knows exactly. And this Babylon, it flourishes. This city-state empire flourishes for a good 200 years. You get a picture here? You get a picture of the ebb and flow of peoples, cultures laying one over the other. This one fades away and another one kind of comes in on top of it, which means that everything that was there before is not swept away. It's more like everything that was there before, pieces of it drop away and pieces of it are assimilated and made use of by the new. And what you get is a melding into another new culture. The Assyrians are in what we would call Upper Iraq to Armenia, Northern Syria, or Kurdistan. Kurdistan today, situated on the border of Turkey and Iraq and Iran, that area across through there, the Kurdistan area. In that time, it was one of the centers of the Assyrian people who came to power in the wake of the original Babylonian Empire. And then they had a reflowering 700 years later, and for a short time, it reached its greatest size. It is the second Assyria that conquers the divided kingdom of Israel and takes the 10 lost tribes into everlasting captivity. You'll read in your biblical text about Syria in the time of David, the king of Syria, and so forth. What we archaeologically got really lucky with is that Ugara and Ebla, which are places, tells where a lot of excavation has revealed many useful things about the culture of the area, show that Syria is really the fountain or wellspring of a lot of, not all, but a lot of the Canaanite religious beliefs. Syria will consistently return to the story. It just keeps cropping up like a bad penny and is repetitively trouble for Israel. And then for Israel and Judah. And then just for Judah, as Israel is no more. Edom, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites. So you got all these ites, all these people groups. They are, the term we've used for ages is tribes. You could call them nations if you want. In our own nation, in our own time, the largest tribe of Native American, American Indian, take your pick, whatever you want to use. Of all the tribes, the largest one is the Navajo, and centered in the southwestern U.S. They occupy large areas, and they are the most numerous. They are not a tribe. They will tell you that in a heartbeat. They get a whole lot more exercised over the fact that they are a people, the people, not just a tribe. They'll get a whole lot more exercised over that than being called American Indians or Native Americans. By and large, they see themselves as a nation people. Well, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and so forth are like that. They're big enough and mobile enough and accomplished enough to be nation groups. And so they are the nation groups that founded cities on what we call the Transjordan Plain. Now let's talk about the geography briefly of the Holy Land. You're looking north and south. This is just the Holy Land, not the whole Fertile Crescent. We're concerned with Israel, Lebanon, Sinai, and Jordan in our day and time, okay? All right, so you've got, on your left, you got the Mediterranean Sea, and then you come in off the sea, and you've got the coastal plain, which runs north to south, and then you've got the spine of the area, which is the Central Mountain region. There's a small break in the Central Mountain region where caravans and invaders could go east to west. And then you go way down into the Jordan Valley. And in the Jordan Valley, whose headwaters are really above what we biblically call the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee is filled up, and the Jordan River proper comes out of it. And it runs all the way down to the Dead Sea, which is in Sinai. And then you cross the Jordan River going to your right, which is going east, and because you're looking north and south, and you cross to your right and you go up up again, and then you come out on what we would call a mesa in the southwestern US, or a plateau, or in Tennessee, Lookout Mountain, which is just a plateau that suddenly stops, and you climb up it, and then it's flat for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles, way down in Georgia as it slowly drops off. That's exactly what the Transjordan Plain is like. Okay? It's huge. And you'll find the nation of Jordan there today. Those tribes, until they are ultimately defeated or absorbed, are hostile to Israel. And it's a long-running battle between them. Okay? Those are kind of the locations of places and some groups. So one of the things that has made a difference in our understanding of translations, histories, how to date things, comes out of all the things that have been discovered almost entirely in the last 200 years through archaeological surprises, dumb luck, or hard work. Mostly hard work, but in a couple of cases, dumb luck. So out of that comes an understanding of some things that are important in the story of these peoples, because we're going to get to history for us, so to speak, starts with the patriarchs, Abraham. And a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, like Sumer, all of those inventions, schooling, so forth, those are all part of his experience. He's living a civilized people by any standard that they would have. And he's going into the unknown. And he's taking all of his possessions, which is an entire train. It's a camel and donkey train, an oxen train, but it's a train. It's a lot of people, a lot of stuff. So out of the world that he will come, cuneiform, which is a wedge-shaped writing system. It's a system of communicating. It's not technically a language. It's used by the Sumerians. Akkadian grows up, and it's a Shemitic language. And Hittites appear on the scene in what we would call the land of far eastern Turkey, far northern Syria, Armenia, and so on. And the Hittites show up and they speak and develop what's called an Indo-European language. It has some things in common with languages that will grow up over the next 2,000 years across the Mediterranean. Not all of them, but some of them. Whereas Akkadian and cuneiform have absolutely nothing in common with those things. Akkadian, being a Shemitic language, will have some aspects of it, just some, that are similar to Hebrew. And you know that in our day, Arabic is a poetic Shemitic language. Arabic is poetic. Hebrew is poetic. English and German are prose. When you translate them, one into the other, that can matter a lot. Because, poetry and prose don't read the same, and they don't translate the same way. Cuneiform and the hieroglyphs of Egypt, and yes, they were both found in Egypt, were major mysteries for thousands of years. But when they were finally unlocked, they opened up an understanding of the ancient Near East, because now we could read all of these things that existed. Hammurabi's code, the steles, which are the big pillars with writing circling around it, or images or hieroglyphs and so forth. And so, starting in 1799, with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, I'm getting ahead of myself, that's okay. And the work that began to be done on it over the course of the next 40 years, Finally, we began to be able to read what the Egyptians left behind. And as you know, even by just watching the Discovery Channel, they left a lot. And now we can read it. And now we can see their stories. And we can decipher this and this and this seem to line up with these parts of Scripture or don't or whatever. The library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, was considered the great library of his time. One of the few times in the pre-Greek era where a library is famous. What was the library of Ashurbanipal? Copies of, and his library would have been in clay tablets. Page 2, page 3 was heavy. Clay tablets. But this is our source of the Babylonian creation account and the Babylonian flood story. The Great Flood is a story found in various forms in a number of ancient cultures. The part of the story of Noah, in which there's a great flood that seems to destroy the earth, is not the unique part of the story of Noah. It's the relationship of Noah, God, and saving creation in its particular form. That is the story of Noah, not the flood itself. That is to say, that makes it unique to itself. The flood itself is found in a number of accounts. The Nuzi tablets were found east of the Tigris River. These clay tablets are about culture, legal, and social structures. They date to roughly the time when the Akkadians have passed away and the Babylonians are holding sway the first time. So you would have had an organized, civilized, government guided, relatively stable and peaceful realm, nations, empire, whatever, where the development of norms and standards and computations and recitations and the giving of law and the passing of it across the land to the peoples and its use by the various representatives of government would make sense. And all of this predates Moshe, Moses. Although Abraham's way ahead, way earlier. The Black Obelisk is a memorial column erected by Shalmaneser III. He's an Assyrian king. On the Black Obelisk, you see King Jehu of Israel, the northern kingdom, showing submission to the Assyrian king on part of the obelisk, paying tribute, showing that he is the vassal, the servant. In his locality, he's the servant of Shalmaneser III, and of the Assyrians generally. Some ancient conquerors operated on the concept of we're in charge of the money, we're in charge of the borders, we're in charge of the military, but what you do locally on your day-to-day basis, as long as you send so much agricultural produce or your mines produce so much silver or whatever, and you send them to the capital or to your governor or your district, whatever, we're all good. Others were more invasive And some were not even that invasive. That would be one of Cyrus' great contributions to the understanding of government, in which Cyrus the Great conquered many peoples. He left their local cultures, their local policies, their local everyday kind of government, their local religions, even their local currencies. He left them all in place. You just had to send your taxes, and if the governor called for a levy of troops or a levy of crops or whatever, you had to produce it. And aside from that, the yoke of Cyrus the Great on most people was so light that they didn't even notice that their king had changed. In being that light-handed, he is pretty close to unique. Sennacherib's prison includes the account of a Jerusalem siege by Sennacherib when he didn't conquer the city. And this can be found, this story about the siege of Jerusalem, can be found in 1 Kings 18 and 19. The prison, which is a discovery of an account of his reign, one piece of it is the Jerusalem siege. But we have a biblical comparison to what's in that prison about the Jerusalem siege. We have that comparison in 1 Kings 18 and 19. The Enuma Elish, which is an ancient creation story of Babylonia and Samaria. It starts before the first Babylonian Empire. They pick it up, and it just keeps evolving. But it's how Marduk formed heaven and earth from Tiamat's body. That's their creation story. There are people, there are academics who want to say that Babylonian creation story existed before the Hebrew creation story, the Babylonian story.
Really? Of course. It's incredibly strongly personal, even outdoors, for the toughest jobs on planet Earth.
Sounds like a really bad Steve.
Now there they are, but I don't.
Are you having bad storms there, Sarah? She muted it, okay. You have some academics who want to argue that the Enuma Elish, in predating the Genesis story of creation, renders it more of a copy of other people's rather than an original story. You have other people who argue with that. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the ancient flood story of Babylon. Utnapishtim was saved in a ship with people and animals. Okay? And there are people who argue that the Epic of Gilgamesh predates the story of Noah, and that might have been a borrowed story. I believe we've got the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then you've got a slide that says that at the top, but there's more at the bottom. You have the Epic of Atrahasis, which is the Sumerian flood story. Like I said, there are a lot of flood stories. Going back to the Code of Hammurabi. These are 282 case laws that include laws regarding economics, family law, criminal law, and civil law. It is the oldest code of any kind of comprehensive legal writing. It is in Akkadian, and it is meant to apply to a wide realm, a big kingdom, And the kingdom is bigger than a tribe or a standard city-state, which they would have called their country. The Ashuna Law Code predates it. And yet the Ashuna Law Code is less comprehensive than the Hammurabi Code, as is the Sumerian laws of Ur-Nammu. They are less comprehensive than the Code of Hammurabi. There are law codes in the Ashuna Law Code and the Sumerian law codes that actually predate the law of Hammurabi. But the Code of Hammurabi is by far the most advanced and comprehensive compendium of law that has survived. Then you have the Cappadocian documents. This is centered on Kanesh in Anatolia. Anatolia is the center of what we now call the nation of Turkey. Anatolia is the bulk of what we call Turkey today. And it is dominated in its middle by the Anatolian Plain, which is even bigger than Transjordan Plain. Cappadocian documents date to about 1900 BC. And by the way, Cappadocia is a province in the Roman Empire. And it is still in that same area when the Roman Empire will be around so many centuries later. In fact, over 1.5 millennium later. And the Cappadocian documents reveal things about trade caravans, legal procedures, local customs, the customs of people passing through that have been recorded. These date to a couple of 100 years, maybe, before the Code of Hammurabi. So what this means is that there's a lot of stuff that scholars in the last 200 years, but especially in the last 100, have been wading through to do a lot of comparisons on language, linguistic issues, using source and form criticism and literary criticism as they look at Old Testament texts in the light of all of these linguistic and legal discoveries. And there is a lot of ferment, has been a lot of ferment about what's going on and what comes before what and which one has what influence on another. Syrian archaeology discoveries include the Ebla tablets and the Ugaritic texts. And the Ebla tablets predate the patriarchs. And there is a window here, there is information here about Mesopotamian culture migrating into Canaan. And the language in the Ebla tablets has helped giving insight into seeing that Hebrew develops later than some of the other Shemitic languages. The Hebrew children come on the scene in the context of the ancient Near East. They come on the scene a lot later than many groups. The Ugaritic texts helped us understand Canaanite religion and some language, semantic, root words, and root concepts in Hebrew. Now, having said all of that, people will say, well, then the Israelites, the Hebrew children, Moses, all those people, they just borrowed stuff from people that was already there. No, not really. But it could be argued that connections between peoples and cultures and how cultures lay in on top of other cultures and how they meld together. Here's what I mean. If you go to the tip of South America, where the Pacific Ocean comes around the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Argentina and Chile, and the Pacific Ocean comes around and they meet, they don't mix. They're not the same temperature, they're not the same color, and it's just like somebody drew a line in the water. And the Pacific water is much bluer, and the Atlantic water is dirtier looking. And it's just like, wow, and you just, why do they not mix? They're both salt water, but they don't. It's kind of fascinating. Well, when cultures butt up against each other, it doesn't work that way. They kind of mingle together on the edges. And over time, what was the edge moves further into culture. Think about the fact that 40 years ago, the number one condiment by dollar sales in the United States was ketchup. You know what it has been for the last 12 years? Number one condiment.
Ranch.
Salsa.
Oh, okay.
I never had salsa as a child or teen. I never saw it, except when we went on vacation, and my dad had it when we were in South Texas. I didn't want to touch the stuff. It didn't look good. That particular trip, I was 10 years old. Yeah, I was an adult when I had salsa. Our culture keeps melting in all kinds of various influences. Cultures do that. Some cultures are more exclusive than others. One of the most exclusive cultures on the planet that pops into mind immediately is the Japanese. But they are an insular country in part because of geography. And that has been so inculcated that they just aren't, even though Japan's a good place and as good as a lot of other places to live, they do not have a lot of refugees or immigrants just dying to get in. It's kind of interesting. It's one of the very few cultures on the planet. It does have influence upon it. They adopted American baseball. They adopted the form of European and American government kind of mixed together. It doesn't operate the same way there, really, but it has a form. But this melding seems to have happened. That does not in any way diminish the divine impact on those who set down the stories of the revelation of God and the faith of God's first his champions and then his people. And let's keep in mind that the stories through the patriarchs, until we get it to Joseph, really, we don't have a people, we have clans that are the people. It's just extended families. And the people that are hangers on to the extended family or owned by the extended family, really, when Joseph gets his brothers and they go to Egypt, they're still not the people. It's after that, it's in Egypt that they really become the people. And being in a place where you feel like you don't fit can create that sense. Egyptian archaeology may be the one that most unlocked the riddles of ancient times. Because the Rosetta Stone, which was discovered and carried away by the British, was discovered under Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1799. It wasn't left in Egypt. And it was the inscription of Ptolemy V Epiphanes. And in it, there are kind of like what we would call a parallel Bible. It's not parallel writing, but it's kind of like a parallel Bible. And you've got Attic Greek, which is the Greek that predates what we call biblical Greek, which is Koine Greek. So you've got Attic Greek, which is like the Greek of Homer and the Odyssey and prior. You've got hieroglyphs, which are the Egyptian picture language, and you've got the Demotic texts. And they translated the Egyptian by the key of the Greek. And Jean Champollion learned Coptic. And he worked back from learning Coptic into the Demotic, which predates Coptic. And then with the Greek text, he got the full recovery of the hieroglyphic meaning. It opened up all of ancient Egypt's many wonders and many stories. For they left, we still don't know how much they left. We're still discovering things that they left. And everything has the hieroglyphic story. They wrote on everything. The Amarna letters come from the 1500s BC. It's correspondence from vassal kings to Egypt and from Egyptian diplomats to Pharaoh. The pharaohs being Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. Akhenaten, by the way, is the pharaoh who did away with the worship of all the old gods and the underworld gods and instituted the worship of the divine sun, which was represented by the obelisk, the sun, in paintings. And that didn't go down real well, and he eventually met his fate, and the old religion was reinstated. Why? Because all the people who were invested in the old religion were kind of like the deep state. What you read about and hear about, people talk about all the time, the deep state. Well, it's kind of like that. There's a whole lot of people there who have vested interests that he is doing away with, and they're not happy about it because their place of privilege and money and so forth have disappeared, and they want them back. And in these Amarna letters, the Canaanites request help against the Haparim. Some people want to argue that means Hebrews. Some people don't. You have execration texts, which are curses, not curse words, but like incantations, curses, written on figurines and vessels, directed against various rebellious vassal kings and peoples of the Egyptians. And this lists numerous Canaanite and Syrian chiefs. And then there's a second set of these texts that refer to locations, not chieftains. This predates many of the things we've talked about in the various places, parts, and peoples. This predates Hammurabi by 150 years. This is contemporaneous with the Cappadocian documents. It is later than the Ebla tablets and the Ugaritic texts. It is much earlier than the Black Obelisk. It is 400 or 500 years earlier than the Nuzi tablets. It is 1,100 years earlier than the Library of Ashurbanipal. Put things in context. Which leads us to the Merneptah stele. This is a poem from Merneptah's time. Merneptah is Egyptian. Stele is a spire, around which, written on a slope, which you read going either up or down, depending on the stele, is the story that they wish to relate. Sometimes it's a long history that's related. On the Merneptah stele is the first occurrence of Israel outside of biblical sources. Roughly 1200, maybe a little earlier, BC. The Shoshank inscription, which attacks Israel and Judah. You can read about this, not the Shoshank inscription, but about the events in 1 Kings 14. It records the attack on Karnak. I'm old enough to think of the long-running skit joke of Johnny Carson on Karnak, the magician. I have no idea if he got the name from this or something else, but every time I read that, I think of that. The Hittite Treaty, which is 1300 down to 1220, which is a treaty of non-aggression between the Hittites and Ramses the Great. There are similarities between this and the literary form of the Sinai Covenant, okay? Now think about it, the Sinai Covenant, the literary form is going to come sometime. The events are going to transpire depending on how you read your timeline. Some people put the Exodus as far back as 1400. Some people put the Exodus back to maybe 1200 BC. But you have similarities in the literary form with the Sinai Covenant of Moses, Moshe. Tale of Sinway the Traveler is dated along with Tom of the Cappadocian Documents, which is a glowing description of Canaan. And there are some scholars who say the idea of a land flowing with milk and honey comes from this, which long predates the Exodus, hundreds of years. Arad is a Bronze Age city yielding political and commercial accounts that are in a time frame of the divided kingdom and of the time of roughly the end of Israel. And of course, Judah will survive another 130 years. In Arad, in the Tell, where they've been digging, they find potsherds, which is ostraka. And then Lachish, there's been a lot of digging at Lachish. And the ostraka shed a lot of light on Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah in 598. You do know that he had more than one invasion, and the final carrying away into captivity was another 10 years after this. Nebuchadnezzar came the first time, he saw, but he didn't conquer Jerusalem. They gathered up, they denuded the place of most of what was worth anything, and they bought him off when he didn't succeed in taking the city right away. But he would be back. We have the inscription at Siloam. You can see in 2 Kings 20, 2 Chronicles 32, and Ecclesiastes 48. The Siloam inscription is about the tunnel work done to the pool of Siloam. People think that the inscription work was done under Hezekiah, King Hezekiah, not the tunnel. But maybe. You have the Gazer calendar, which is a 7-line tablet which describes months and seasons. You have the Moabite stone, which names Omnius, king of Israel, who subjugated Moab. This is from the 800s BC. And you have the Samaria ostraka, which have notations from the warehouses of Jeroboam II or Menahem, kings of Israel. That's quite a lot. What do all these things mean? Well, each one has its own value, but when you put all of it together, you have a picture of a world in which people are developing civilizations. They are doing what people do. People cultivate, reproduce, build, interact, develop commerce. And when you attempt to develop commerce, then you have to have law. And when you get into the development of a society where people live in proximity to one another, you wind up having to have family law, civil law, criminal law, business law. Those are not new ideas, not new ideas to Western civilization. There's some things that are, but those are not. And Israel doesn't develop in a vacuum. The story of God's people doesn't happen in isolation. The struggle of the people is in a context of a world where there is tremendous fluidity and there are movements of entire peoples. And when we take a break here and come back, we'll get into that. Movements of entire people groups into lands that were settled. And there are stresses that come about with that and clashes. You have competing ideas about religion, government, not tremendously competing. Everybody had similar, though nuanced, different ideas. You have different ideas about life and death. That's a big one because it affects how you treat one another. You have some religions that grow up with a cult of death. That's an overstatement to make the point that sacrifice of people can happen. You have cultures that grow up that so value male children that if you have 3 girls, well, they might do their own form of abortion. Just put them out until the animals take them or they die from exposure. Israel breaks the mold in that God gives them a direct command that they are not allowed to do such things. They are not allowed to take life carelessly. They are not allowed to kill the helpless. So, you can extrapolate out of that what you want to, and most everybody will, for our day. But Israel, the Hebrews, grow up with all of these things going on. And Abraham comes out of one of these stories. And other people who enter the scene, like a Shakespearean play, where people walk on the stage and off the stage, in a sense, all of these different groups are at some point a part of the story of God's people. And it's in the context of all of those interactions that the revelation of God and who He is and how we are to be happens. And that's why those things matter. So let's see, where are we on time? We're doing great. Take a couple of minutes and I'll be right back to you. We'll be right back here in just, give it 4 or 5 minutes, Jim. Okay. Oh, betcha. It's getting cold outside.
I noticed when I left work, the temperature was cooler than it was this morning when I got to work.
Mhm. Let's see if I can make this work a little bit better. Now, I have to get close to it to zoom it in. Well, that's the wrong way, Phil. Let's see where that puts the old noggin.
There you go.
Better. That's better. Yeah, that's a lot better. Okay, good. Yeah, that's a lot better. Lot better. About 3 minutes. Where was that?
So you're a nurse? Do you work at a hospital?
I'm working in a primary care clinic for people. We see the moms and children in the reverse. We see the spouses and we get the next. And we are targets. For them, yeah, so we're for those all that. Many years ago, so this is not my job ever. Yeah, that's a little bit.
Have you worked in a hospital before?
I haven't worked in the hospital, I have worked nursing home, home health, special urology, that kind of thing. And I've done family care. So, it's kind of everybody's in this with the babies and all families.
My mom is a stage 4 cancer patient and her radiology nurses, I like watch them have such an impact on her that I wanted to go to school to be a radiology nurse to be kind of that second person for other cancer patients, but then I realized that I was literally just going to be like the happy face there for them, and I wasn't actually interested in other stuff, so.
Get coffee.
That's how it ends up here.
That's the
All right, let me talk this over. You smell it, just smell it. You never smelled it.
Yeah.
Oh.
I used to work at Barstow Cafe, right, so.
Well, yeah.
I was there for the switch from Republic of Tea to Tazo stuff. So Gotcha. Yeah, we used to have Republican tea, which I preferred Republican tea over Tennessee.
Have you ever smelled this stuff?
No.
Okay.
I can smell it from here.
Is it like orange?
It's the sweet orange.
And it's good. Caffeine free. Orange peel, lemongrass, citrus herbs, and licorice.
I didn't know tea was caffeine free.
My wife's new favorite.
My doctors always told me to not drink tea because of my kidneys, so I thought it had caffeine in it, but.
The herbal tea doesn't. And it's basically not made from tea leaves, it's made from
Like
like
flowers and stuff
flowers
like that.
and
Oh.
like
Yeah,
lemon peel, orange peel.
herbal teas have no caffeine at all. Green teas have some caffeine, it's less than black teas.
I didn't know
Yeah, so you could probably do herbal teas.
Like
Yeah.
hibiscus
And some of the
tea,
herbal teas are really good. Mint teas you can do, like as long as it's not like mint green tea or whatever.
Are those the kind that like help you when you're sick?
Yes.
Yeah, some, yeah.
Okay. My husband always drinks like this certain kind of tea when he's sick, and he always tells me to, and I'm like, I can't, but I guess I can, so,
Make sure it's.
Also,
yeah.
I had to, like,
Okay.
5 years ago, I had to do a candida diet for a few weeks to do sugar cleanse and everything. And I couldn't have any caffeines on it. And so they were like, if you want to substitute some things, because like habitually, whatever, you can drink chicory root coffee, which is, it's not made from coffee beans, it's made from chicory root, and it supposedly has kind of like that, it's got a kind of
Coffee-ish.
coffee-ish flavor, it's a little more sweet. Like there's a,
Okay.
or dandelion root tea.
There we are. All right, Sarah's back.
Certainly has the movies on demand every Tuesday.
Hence my thing about sounds like Stephen King. Hear their voices. Okay.
Can you teach me how to be awesome?
Hey, Sarah, can you mute your microphone?
Entire village.
Great, thank you. We were getting a lot of background noise. All right, thank you. You got any questions, anybody? Comments, observations? There's a lot of stuff. Aren't you glad you don't have to memorize all of it for a test?
I was thinking about that. I was
Oh,
like,
I didn't know we didn't have tests. I thought we did. I thought it'd be like pop quiz or something.
Well, I mean, I may ask you some pointed questions, but now, when you hear about this people or that people and this issue and that issue, and you read histories, you can get some interesting things. When I was studying ancient history as a youngster, and I did as a youngster, it was just interesting to me. I read about the Hyksos, who were supposedly, according to the old histories, old being old to me, older than me. They were this fierce people who came out of the east and who conquered the Egyptian empire. And they were captive shepherds was the meaning of their name. And over time, this idea grew up in the last couple of hundred years that the Hyksos might have been a Hebrew community living in Egypt. And when they were kicked out, it provided the story of the book of Exodus, but there's no evidence for that. No Egyptian record records these people as slaves or anything else. Their ethnic origins are unknown. And the only ancient source we have from Manetho, whose work was about 300 years before Jesus, during what we call the Ptolemaic, starts with a P, Ptolemaic dynasty, the last of what could be called an Egyptian dynasty. His work is lost. The only thing we have is that Flavius Josephus had his work apparently and used it and included some of it in his own writings, and that was in the first 100 years after Jesus, actually the first 75 years after Jesus. Apparently, that's wrong. And this has been perpetuated for generation after generation. We do know that they were eventually driven from Egypt, sort of, by Ahmose the First of Thebes, whose rule ended in 1544 BC, who initiated what's called the New Kingdom of Egypt. There's an old kingdom, which is akin to the first Babylonian Empire, and then there's a middle kingdom when the power of Egypt waned and weakened, and then there's the new kingdom, and most of what you think of when you think of the Pharaoh of the movies is from the New Kingdom era, which is just rounded off and say 1500 BC to 1000 BC if you want to. Something like that. And what really seems to have happened is that these people came in small numbers to what we would call northern Egypt, up by the Mediterranean Sea, north of Memphis on that map that you had. And there's a city there that they turned into a commercial dynamo. It was the Hong Kong of its day. And as they succeeded, more and more of their people immigrated until in that district, which would be something like Middle Tennessee, as an example. They were the dominant group and the Egyptians were in a minority. And then they took control and they extended their control upriver because the current runs south to north and they're in the north. They extend upriver about halfway between Memphis and Thebes. And they control that much of the land of Egypt. The king of Thebes controls from their borders down between Thebes and Cush. The king of the Nubians controls Nubia, the capital of which is at Cush, which is on the upper Nile River. And you know, in the upper Nile River, it splits and you've got a white Nile and a blue Nile. And the two of them converge and they become the Great Nile River. The Hyksos seemed to have been something very different than what we were long told and what was passed along by Josephus. And the port town is called Avaris, and it becomes highly important. The Egyptians would have called these Hyksos Asiatic people. That was their term for anybody who wasn't one of them. That didn't get into our language that way. But the Roman term for anybody who wasn't one of them, barbar, did get into our language as barbarian. And so they gained control of the eastern delta and then the north delta, and they forged contracts until finally they just kind of organically took over. The second intermediate period of Egypt was simply a time when the Egyptian empire was not at its strongest, but it was not a weak, can't do anything kingdom. It just wasn't strong enough to do everything. And so you had going from the mouth of the Nile on the Mediterranean, south, upriver. You had three kingdoms, if you will, who engaged in trade with one another. We have records of it. The Egyptians kept records of Hyksos ships going right through the Egyptian lands, right up to Cush, and of Nubians going all the way down from Cush to Avaris, and of the Theban-centered Egyptian kingdom, trading in both directions. But eventually, it reached a point to where the Hyksos adopted Egyptian customs, Egyptian religions, Egyptian dress, and they began to meld one culture into the other. But finally, the Thebans grew strong enough to come and kick out those that were still identifiable as Asiatic and reclaim their former empire. I tell you that story to make this point. What we learn archaeologically often confirms something we have long taught and believed, and sometimes clearly contradicts it. Evidence through archaeology continues to grow. It's not over. So it's in this world setting that the stories of the Pentateuch are going to develop and eventually be passed on and written down. And so we want to look at the divisions of the Pentateuch for a few minutes. For the Old Testament is why we're here. So you have primeval history. It's Genesis 1 through 11. And in Genesis 1 through 11, you have what I would say is a complete self-revelation of the character of Almighty God and His grace for us. And the rest of the book is exposition, all of the book. But in Genesis 1 through 11, you have what some people call the myth of creation, the myth of the great flood, the myth of the Tower of Babel. Some people call them literal truths. But let's talk about it for a minute, about myth in the ancient Near East, of which these people were part and parcel. Myth, in our day and age, gets a bum rap because it's equated with children's fable, untrue, dismissive. That's just stupid. But myth is about truth and knowledge. It's about a truth for a time, a place, and a people. A myth is to make a point or a series of points or an explanation about someone, quite often God, and us. And so if we talk in a slightly more technical and thoughtful term of the Old Testament, or particularly the Pentateuch, and particularly Genesis, if we talk about the myth of the creation story, we're not talking about it being a falsehood. We're not talking about it being a fable. Maybe a better way of talking is that it is one of those timeless stories, the point of which is the point. And what is the point? That ultimately everything comes from God, And ultimately, everything and everyone is responsible to God. And ultimately, God holds all people, including those he so dearly favors, Adam and Eve, as the starting example, he holds all to an account. And ultimately, the root of sin, it's all in Genesis 1 through 11, the root of sin is wanting to take God's place. After all, the temptation for the food, the forbidden tree, isn't that it's good fruit or all kinds of things, or that they'll be happy or anything else. The temptation is that you will know like God. The root of sin can be simply summed up as, I'm going to take God's place. And while we don't stop and think about our actions, our decisions, or our attitudes in those words, we so often are doing exactly that. And we read in Exodus 20 to start this class that he is what kind of God was it in there?
Jealous.
Oh yeah, jealous God. Don't take my place. It's right there. I mean, it's as blunt as it gets. Don't take my place. Don't do my job. Don't take my place. Don't play my part. So those myth stories each exist to reveal truth from God and truth about us in relationship to God and one another. Cain and Abel, so truth in relationship to God and to one another. And you can call it the myth, or you can call it the literal story, or you call it whatever you want. Jonah fits into this category. To call it a myth doesn't mean it's a fable or that it couldn't possibly have physically happened one way or the other, however anybody wants to take it. It's to say that the story of Jonah and the whale is the story of a man who's supposed to be a man of God under God's hand and direction and blessing, disobeying God and running away as fast as he can from what God has told him he must do. And God saying, okay, I'm the master of good staging, watch this. Okay? And the people who told that story would have understood that, as well as the ones who heard it. We sometimes, in our literalistic age, where history is strictly chronology and action, and where we have denuded ourselves of the glory and the joy of all of the aspects of the mythic experience, the way we're talking about myth. And when we do that, we miss some of the true wisdom of living in the story. Because the stories exist for our blessing and our wisdom. So, primeval history is Genesis 1 through 11. Etiology drives our search for meaning. What is etiology? Okay, there's a definition right there on your screen, the effort to know why. When we start talking technically, professionally, about Scripture, especially if we start talking about it academically, we have to invent words for everything. You know that, right? I say that tongue planted firmly in the cheek. Really, we come up with words so that we won't have to use whole sentences. We got a word that has a definition, and so we don't have to constantly be given definitions. We just use a word. Etiology is the effort to know why. Etiology drives our search for meaning. You got a 3-year-old, and you say, eat your green peas, they're good for you. Why? And if you try to answer that, you know what comes when you get done with your effort to answer it. Why? And on and on and on without ever stopping. Why? And little does the 3-year-old know that they are practicing etiology. You see, now you'll never forget it. Other ancient Near Eastern cultures had creation and flood myths. And God uses a very familiar format. I mean, these circulating stories are stories that can communicate God's truth in God's hands. By the way, I have to tell you, I know the fellow who is absolutely convinced, has pictures, has wood samples, and knows that he has found Noah's Ark. He's also a guy who leads tours to the Mountain of God, which is in Saudi Arabia, just across the Gulf of Aden, and from Sinai. And he didn't convince me. A group of explorers who went when it wasn't legal to go convinced me that I believe everything in that particular location says is the Mount of God. It is where God met Moses, Moshe. I'm not betting against this guy when he says and he shows me his evidence for the ark. And if I ever get the money together, I may go look at it myself with him. He ain't getting any younger. The utterly unique feature of ancient Israel's primeval history. Here it is. It reveals the truth of God about us, about the we, W-E, not W-I-I, and the He, the great I am. The form of these primeval myth stories is similar to others, but the revelation of the truth from God about us, about our relationship horizontally, and about who He is and His relationship with us, denies the very pagan concepts that exist in all of the other stories, all of the other myths. The God of Israel reveals Himself to be unique even in the midst of things that may seem familiar. And as we extrapolate out of that and look at our day, we talk in Wesleyan terms of God coming to us and speaking in the ordinary means of grace. And somehow people get the idea, yeah, they're ordinary. Well, no. He uses the ordinary extraordinarily well. And we should never look down on all of His ordinary methodologies to bless us. If we didn't have all the ordinary, how would we ever understand the extraordinary?
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Real quick? So all the talk about myth and everything is reminding me a lot. Like a year and a half ago, I did a class I did a certificate recently in theopoetics. And I had a class on the intro of writing as ministry. And we went over different genres. And one of the genres that we talked about was parables. And so like this is making me think about parables and how God always confirms and uses like parallelism and stuff. So we have the myth in the Old Testament and you have parallels of Jesus in the New Testament. And,
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. The parables are, in a sense, a telling of the myth for the same reasons. And so what we should be willing to say to each other is that there's a place for it. We move out of primeval history into patriarchal history. You have the great story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph and his brothers. It's the rest of Genesis. Much of what we get of cultural stuff and action part of the stories and the settings that are recounted are validated by external sources like the ones that we went through in the long list tonight. The biblical account of the patriarchs in setting and culture and tradition and some forms of action rings true across different sources. Patriarchal history is followed by the Exodus and the wilderness history, which is Exodus through Deuteronomy. This is the story of those tribes descended of the sons of Leah and Rachel, becoming the nation, the chosen people of Israel. And it is in the time of this story, or at the end of this story in a sense, that the history of the people of Israel as the people of God becomes a traceable history that you can put on a chronological list. Not perfectly in all cases, especially in Judges, but certainly you can roughly. If you can just decide and get everybody to agree on a starting point. Now, there are diachronic and synchronic approaches to analyzing the Pentateuch. Diachronic really comes out of source criticism. Dia is through. The diachronic is through what sources? And it's out of diachronic analysis that we get what we call the four-source concept of the Pentateuch. It seems that there are four different identifiable sources or strains of writing. And we, many ages ago, applied the term, many years ago, applied the term documentary hypothesis to the four-source concept. Documentary, the recording thereof, the telling of the story. By hypothesis, we can't prove it, but four sources, the documentary hypothesis of how we got Pentateuch. And those sources are the Yahwist, which is represented, if you're reading a commentary that does these kinds of things, by J. The material of this source refers to God as Yahweh, as the Tetragrammaton. The Elohist, represented by E, is where the material refers to God as Elohim. The priestly source, represented as P, is a source that is really wound up in law, ritual, and, of all things, statistics. God is really into math. Read your Pentateuch. The statistics are stultifying. There's quite a lot. But they have their place. The Deuteronomic source, represented by D, emphasizes centralized worship, or ultimately, tabernacled in the temple. One place of God's choice, the temple of God. Those are your 4 sources of the documentary hypothesis. They have different language, different terminology. They have, between these 4 sources, there are 2 different names for God. There are 2 names for the covenant mountain. There are 2 names for the, call them Palestinian natives, Canaanites. The stories appear to blend 2 accounts. The flood story, there are 7 pair of clean animals and 1 pair of every animal. In the story of Joseph being sold, there's 2 accounts. Reuben pleads for Joseph and he's sold to Midianites. Judah pleads for Joseph and he's sold to Ishmaelites. And you can see through these kinds of things why scholars who were first into source and literary criticism were looking at this and going, oh, we need to tear all these parts apart and analyze them, rather than look at them what you and I would call holistically. Because, oh, well, these can't possibly agree. I mean, who sold him? And who did they sell him to? They can't agree on this. The Bible can't be the perfect word of God. That's you can get there real fast with this stuff. Okay. But then there's a synchronic, that's all the diachronic analysis of the Pentateuch, okay? Then you've got a synchronic analysis. And it is best represented by the new literary criticism. Because what it does, instead of finding all of these pieces and breaking them apart, it emphasizes ties in the account that tie it together and make it a unit, that make it holistic. And so it's an envelope type pattern. Promise, wilderness, law, wilderness, promise, wilderness, law, promise. You get the, and you look at those, and those are forms of telling the myth to expound the truth, rather than different people pulling in different directions. That doesn't mean that different people weren't involved in writing. The Pentateuch is an oral history for some time before it is a written history. Because they were not what we would call a literary people in the beginning. There are some interesting themes in the Pentateuch. One of the themes is covenant. What's God's covenant with Noah?
He will never again destroy the earth by flood.
Okay. Well, what's his covenant with Abraham?
Make your descendants as numerous as the stars and the grains of sand.
Well, what's his covenant with Moses?
He will give his chosen people the promised land.
These covenants are about future promises, which the people with whom the covenant is made will never experience. Noah will never experience a life long enough to know that God never floods the earth, so to speak. that this was a one-time thing and it won't happen again. And the jokester in me, it's my sense of humor, wants to say, which means that I guess all the polar caps and the icebergs can't possibly all melt because we're not going to all be flooded to death because God said so. And that's the jokester in me. In our day and time, that passes for very dry humor. And I'm good with dry humor. Covenant with Abram has many pieces to the story. When God seals that covenant, for example, what happens to Abraham? While God seals the covenant that he makes with Abraham, what happens? Falls asleep.
Yeah.
Goes into a deep slumber. And God completes the covenant for him. There's what is a covenant? It's an agreement, a solemn, binding agreement. And in ancient law, a covenant is binding agreement that binds a lesser personage in duty to a greater personage. That's the standard of covenant. In the ancient Near East, that's that epoch of time between roughly 4000 BC and 500 BC. In that epoch, covenant you could represent as marriage. In most of the cultures, there is a superior party covenanting an inferior party. That's a fact. That's the way they saw it. That's the way it was treated. Wasn't exactly that way with what we came to call the Jews. We didn't come to call them Jews until long after. And where does it come from? Because Judea was what was left when the 10 tribes disappeared forever. So the people of God are basically left in Judea, and they become the Jews. That's what we get. And until that's all that's left, they're really the Israelites, the children of God, the Hebrew people, so forth. And then we cross that line in history where things have changed and circumstances have changed, and then they become the Jews, and they are evermore. So the covenant with Abram is a covenant between a superior and an inferior. Not hard to figure out which is which, right? But the inferior falls asleep. It's caused to go into a deep slumber, which would, in any culture of the A and E, be a supreme insult to the superior party. But instead of killing him, which in a lot of cultures and a lot of cultural myths might have been the case, the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, the great I Am, completes the covenant. And when they arrange the sacrifices, the inferior party walks between the sacrifices in the presence of the superior and says, "Be it unto me as to these, if I do not keep my covenant with you, O whoever." In this case, O Elohim. But Abraham sleep. And we're told that the presence of God went between and passed through. The superior passed through on behalf of the inferior. Now, you can preach that. Oh, you can preach that. You can write stories. You can come up with children's applications. Now, you can preach that. Because if that's not grace, I do not know what. If you can't preach grace out of that, we need to go back to square one. But that's the covenant with Abraham. And do you see a progression? Covenant with Noah is a progression of what I will not do on God's part. The covenant with Abraham is a covenant of what I will do. How I will bless you. But it is very generic. I will make your descendants as the stars of the sky, or the sands of the earth, all these kinds of imageries. You're going to have a lot of descendants. That's all it says. Which is a big deal to a man who has no children and whose preferred wife is barren, and whose God doesn't seem to have any pity on him. And when we come back to Abraham, I think it's in the next session, some of the things that Abraham does in response to what God says is hilarious. And then you have the covenant with Moses. I will give to my people the promised land. All right? But you, while you'll see it, you shall not enter into it because of your disobedience previously. But my people shall inhabit the promised land. And so it is a narrowing, a focusing of the broad promise to Abraham. But God also made a promise to Abraham, didn't he? I will give you a promised land. And where was he when he did that? Shechem. We'll come back to that one next session. So covenant is not static. Covenant is progressive. And in each case, covenant is initiated by the superior, not a petition from the inferior. It's God's idea to start with. The second theme is the promise of land. What kind of world did they live in? Did they live in a information age? Did they live in a industrial age? They didn't even live in the Iron Age. Maybe the early Bronze Age, maybe. So if you live in what is essentially an agrarian society with a small trader class on top of it, because that's what they had, then what really matters is land. It's hard to convey what land means unless you have an attachment to a certain piece of land that has a very long history. I'm trying to get my emotions around the fact that my family land, my father's family have had this land in their title, the piece that still is in the family, since 1785. It was a grant of the legislature of North Carolina. It was a huge amount of land in Middle Tennessee. Today, it's 100 acres. But it's been in the family since before Tennessee was a state. It's land on which my father grew up. This very piece. It's land on which he and I cut Christmas trees when I was a child. It's where I went squirrel hunting. There's about a 40-acre wooded tract. And on a fall after Sunday afternoon, that's where I first kissed my wife, when we were walking through the woods. It's where I played. It's where I work in the land, where we built a place for my dad and cleared a rough piece of land. It's where I literally sweated and bled, as did my son, to keep it up, what we had done. I am connected to that piece of land emotionally, deeply, but I can't keep it. I can't keep it. I don't have the ability. So I'm trying to wrap my mind around my emotions, not my mind, around letting go of a patrimony, of a promised land. Take that idea of the value of the land and how much it means, and then pump it up 1,000 times. That's what the land means to them. It's everything. It is their identity. It is their life, not just their livelihood. It is the one thing they can give to their sons. And hopefully they can give their daughters, it's the way they would have looked at it, to men who received the same from their fathers. We cannot totally grasp, I can, what this promise of land means. To someone from the A&E who is now a wanderer like Abraham, the promise of land is beyond explaining. And when the promise is made to the people gathered on the plain before the mountain of God, and he makes the motion, he makes the promise, we're going to go into the promised land and you're going to possess it. It's to say that it is a deeply joyful thing to receive just doesn't cover it. So this covenant language, the covenant that God comes and initiates commitments with us in which he commits himself on our behalf, is a big thing. And this idea of the promise of land is bigger than, we don't ever really preach it anymore because we're so removed from the land as a culture. The vast majority of us don't have a connection to a place that runs deep. We have memories of a place, my grandma's house. My grandma's house sold at auction 16 years ago. And it's just half a mile up the road from the land that has been in my family all those generations. I never had any trouble letting go of my grandmother's house. Generally, we have a house, maybe it's 1/4 of an acre, 1/2 an acre, an acre, 2 acres maybe. But we don't have that same kind of deep, rooted, emotional, psychological, you can't divorce me from my land. We don't have that. But it is to them the very reality of life. Okay, the next theme is abundance and fruitfulness. In a world where there was a great deal of drought, famine, and a lot of land that was arid, and where water was life, abundance and fruitfulness is pretty big stuff. I was in Montana in January. And my wife and I, and my daughter, who's an architect, drove out to a place called the Wine Glass. Well, These are 10-acre tracts. It's the wine glass. Let me tell you, the original settlers of the West riding in Conestoga wagons did not travel a rougher road than we did going through the wine glass. I was in that SUV thinking, my wife with her spinal problems cannot travel a road like this every time we want to leave a house. We were looking at all the properties there and talking about our retirement time to be close to the kids. Maybe we'll do that. Who knows what tomorrow holds. But anyway, we look at our retirement days, when they come that way. The wine glass, if you don't get a well 300 feet down, you're not gonna have any water. And it don't rain a whole lot. There's grass. It's brown. There's rocks, they're gray and brown. There's mountains in the distance and they're tall and got snow on them. No trees in the wine glass. Scrub shrubs, no trees. It is high prairie. It's extremely dry prairie with native grasses. And that's what it is. That's exactly the picture of a lot of the land that these people traveled through in the stories of the Old Testament. Milk and honey, which is a mythic or parable type thing to sum up the whole thing in a phrase rather than a whole description. This abundance and fruitfulness is like, wow. If you live on the wine glass, you can only dream of trees and green grass and a stream running through your property, because there isn't going to be one except during the heavy rain when it comes, and it might come 3 times a year, in which case, there'll be a gully wash between 2 hillocks down through there, and stuff will wash away, and then it dries back out for the next 6 months. Because they only have 3 seasons, because they have winter, summer, and fire season. And that's the truth. So it's in that world, in a world where there are places that are, I could have this land, the bottom land of Egypt, breadbasket, ultimately for the Roman Empire, for the Egyptian Empire. One of the reasons Egypt was so desirable. The lands in the fertile plain, coastal plain that the Philistines had, and that they were constantly fighting with Israel on the borderlands of. Why? It's good land to raise wheat. If you get over to Transjordan, it's lousy land, there's no water. Down in the Jordan Valley, well, you've got water and you can divert ditches and you can irrigate and you can grow things. And up in Galilee, there's more water than there is as you get further south. And you can have great vineyards. I'm talking about in ancient times, great vineyards. And this would have been the land of Manasseh when the tribes settled the land. So the promise of that land is like dream come true. It's like being made Warren Buffett's sole inheritor. I'm going to inherit how many billions of dollars kind of picture. It's that kind of picture to them. So multiplying fruitfulness is part of the promise and the story and the picture of God's people from the Garden of Eden to the promise to Abraham to the story of the Hebrew nation coming out of the wandering in Sinai and coming to take possession of the promised land. This whole idea of having it all kind of thing from in their world, their understanding of what having it all meant. Flocks and grazing lands and crop lands and woodlands and water. It's so exciting. Abundance and fruitfulness are core themes in the Pentateuch. So, covenant, promise of land, abundance and fruitfulness all make perfect sense because of the world they live in. But there's one more theme. It's the law and the sacrificial system. The law. The teaching of the truth of God and of how we shall live before our God, ascribed to Moses. Given of the law is from Exodus 19 to Numbers 10. Here are God's instructions. To quote Francis Schaeffer from 50 years ago, this is how we then shall live. Leviticus is all about the system of sacrifices. It is essentially the priestly system of atonement and of making right your standing before God and with others. And Deuteronomy is the Harvard Law Review of the Pentateuch. For the giving of the law, the sacrificial system, and then the law review. It's kind of interesting that you have to have a review. But that's what Deuteronomy is. You have to have a review. And in Deuteronomy 6, you have the summation to which Jesus will, in essence, point all those ages later. In which in Deuteronomy 6, you have the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And have no other gods before you. That's the Shema. The devout Hebrew was to repeat the Shema with sincerity to begin his day. It turned into the Shema plus some other things over time. But hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Wow. And that's what Jesus will point to when he's challenged what is the greatest commandment. He doesn't give any of the 10 commandments. He gives the Shema and he expands on it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus apparently read the law review. Or maybe he wrote the law review. In a sense. Questions? Now, on your outline this week, I had 14, I think, more slides than last week. Okay, and we are coming up to 48, which is last. Okay. Questions about covenant, promise of land, abundance and fruitfulness, the law and sacrificial system. You say, well, when are we going to get into the Old Testament? Next week. gonna get into it next week. And for next week, read Genesis 12, where the patriarchal history starts. List the places in Abraham's journey in chapter 12. Whatever the places are. According to Genesis 12, according to the places listed, according to that one chapter of what you read, where would you place the location of the promised land? Not what you think it would be from all the things you've heard over the years, or sermons you've heard, or Bible stories you read. Strictly limited to what you have in front of you in Genesis chapter 12. And out of that alone, where would you identify the location of the promised land as God relates it to Abraham? But we'll talk about that next week. I believe I have the pages right, but I want you to make sure you have covered in the textbook, and you may have already done some of this, 61 to 100. I think I'm right about that.
I meant to take a picture of the
I saw
chapter.
it, I got it, and I used it.
Did I send it to you?
sent
Okay.
it. I used
That
it.
was one of those, like, I thought that maybe I did
You
it,
did.
and then I didn't remember if
And I much appreciate you did it, and I went back and reviewed it before I put these numbers on here to make sure. When I went through and edited all of this, I don't do everything brand new every time I do this, but it's never the same as it was the last time, okay? And reading the Psalms, working your journals, and the Psalm of Reflection is 91. And come prepared next week to tell me about Psalm 91 for you. I don't care about you telling me what it says. I'm I'm calling a couple of you probably. Tell me about Psalm 91 for you. For you. Don't recount what it says. For you. What does it say for you? Okay? Questions? Great. I got you out here with 30 minutes to spare. All right. And you can always call or write, send cards and letters and so forth if you have questions as you're in an assignment. I got a call about something that somebody was in the middle of this week. Yeah, always do. If I'm able to answer the phone, I will. All right.
I do ask for clarification. The Psalm assignment is our journaling assignment.
Right.
Okay, so it's not something to be turned in.
That's correct. The Psalm assignment is journaling, part of your journaling. It's not something to turn into me. When I say I'm probably going to call on a couple of you to just talk about what Psalm 91 is for you, that's literally oral. Okay.
So what about on the syllabus where it says that you want one of our journals sent in for week 3?
That's next week.
Got it, okay.
That's
I
next
thought you meant you like wanted it, like in your hands on week 3, but okay,
When you've done week 3,
okay.
I want you to send me a day.
Okay.
From your 3rd week of journal.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the other one is when you've done it, one day from your journaling in week 5.
Okay.
All right, I think I figured out how to shuffle this thing down. Sorry about that. All right. We'll see you next week. I can say that, right? You still here, right? Yeah. Have a good one, man.
Y'all have a good night.
All right. Good night, Sarah.
Good night.